You know you need more discipline. You've known this for years, maybe longer. It's not a secret. Discipline is what separates people who build things from people who talk about building things. And on some level, every ambitious person knows this is the gap that matters. You're successful in plenty of ways. You've climbed in your career. You've built a life that looks good from the outside. You've achieved things that younger versions of yourself would have celebrated. But there's one specific area where discipline keeps failing you. And it's not because you're lazy or undisciplined as a person. It's because your brain changed, and nobody explained the mechanism. So you've been fighting a battle you didn't know was happening at the neurological level. You want to write that book, start that business, commit to the fitness routine that actually matters, or finally have the conversation you've been avoiding. You know exactly why you should do it. You can articulate the reasons in perfect detail. But when you sit down to do the disciplined work, something inside your brain whispers a seductive excuse, and you believe it, which means another day passes without the hard thing getting done. This isn't weakness. This isn't proof that you lack willpower compared to other successful people. What's happening is pure neurochemistry. Your brain has learned that the pain of effort isn't worth the reward, so it offers you easier hits instead. And you take them because your dopamine system has been hijacked by your own survival instincts. Here's the breakthrough that changes everything. Discipline doesn't require more willpower, because willpower isn't the problem. Dopamine architecture is. This audiobook reveals one scientific secret. A single neurological principle that rewires how the brain experiences effort. Once applied correctly, this one action makes hard things feel not just possible, but genuinely rewarding. Because it fundamentally changes the chemistry that was sabotaging discipline in the first place. Not through force, not through motivation hacks or productivity systems. Through understanding exactly how the brain processes reward and what simple movement does to restore the neurological pathways that make discipline automatic. Consider Richard, a successful professional who'd built something significant, but couldn't start the one project that mattered most: his book. For years, he tried everything: motivation, schedules, accountability partners. And nothing worked because the real problem wasn't his commitment level. His brain had learned that the pain of writing wasn't worth the distant reward, so it offered easier dopamine hits instead. Scrolling, organizing, busy work. His prefrontal cortex, the part that handles discipline and delayed gratification, was losing its grip, exactly as neuroscience shows happens to everyone at some point. Then he discovered this one principle about brain chemistry and movement. Within 3 weeks, he'd written 50 pages. Within 2 months, the first draft was complete. The change wasn't willpower. The change was neurochemical. This audiobook isn't another motivational speech about trying harder or believing in yourself more. It's the science of why your discipline breaks down. Why smart, successful people like you fail at hard things despite having every advantage. And the single neurological secret that flips everything. By the end of this book, you won't just understand why hard things feel impossible. You'll understand exactly what your brain needs to make them feel inevitable. And you'll have one simple, evidence-based action you can start today. But first, you need to see the trap you're already in, because understanding the problem is how you escape it. Chapter 1. Why your brain sabotages discipline. The human brain is not broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do: keep the body alive and the organism comfortable. The problem is that the environment it evolved to handle no longer exists. For hundreds of thousands of years, the brain developed survival mechanisms that made perfect sense in a world of actual physical danger. Immediate threats, scarce resources, and the constant need to conserve energy for emergencies. The amygdala, that ancient part of the brain responsible for threat detection and survival responses, became the dominant force in human consciousness. When danger appeared, it hijacked the prefrontal cortex, the thinking, planning, future-focused part of the brain, and the body flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, preparing for fight, flight, or freeze. This system saved human lives for millennia. A person heard a rustling in the bushes. Their amygdala activated instantly, and they ran. A person saw a predator. Their body mobilized for action, and they survived. The amygdala's job was to keep them alive by prioritizing immediate threats over everything else. It was brilliant evolutionary design. But now, in a world where the biggest dangers are self-imposed, a difficult conversation with a business partner, the vulnerability required to write something that matters, the discomfort of physical exertion, that ancient survival brain is still running the same program. When a successful person sits down to do something challenging, their amygdala doesn't recognize the difference between a physical predator and the internal discomfort of discipline. It interprets the resistance, the difficulty, the effort required, and it screams, danger. Move away from this. Find something easier. Do anything but this. The amygdala has no concept of long-term goals or abstract ambitions. It doesn't care about the book someone wants to write in 2 years, or the business they want to build, or the fitness level they want to achieve. All it knows is, this moment, right now, involves discomfort. The amygdala's only job is to eliminate discomfort immediately. So it does what it's always done. It hijacks the brain's resources and redirects them toward escape. What's remarkable is how fast this happens. Neuroscience research shows that the amygdala processes threat signals about 12 milliseconds faster than the prefrontal cortex can consciously register what's happening. 12 milliseconds. That's faster than the blink of an eye. That's faster than conscious thought. That's fast enough that by the time someone consciously decides to sit down and write, their nervous system has already decided to check email instead. The ancient survival brain doesn't debate. It doesn't negotiate. It simply acts. And the thinking brain finds itself playing catch-up, trying to rationalize decisions that were already made at an unconscious level. This explains something that almost everyone with a discipline problem experiences. The moment of confusion where they intended to do something important, and suddenly they're doing something completely different, with no memory of the decision to switch. They meant to write. Now they're scrolling. They meant to call their friend. Now they're reorganizing their desk. They meant to start the project. Now they're planning the project instead of executing it. This isn't absent-mindedness. This isn't a lack of focus. This is the amygdala winning a race that the conscious mind didn't even know was happening. Understanding this timing is crucial, because it reveals why willpower alone can never work as a solution. Willpower is a conscious function. The amygdala operates below consciousness. The brain is literally faster at avoiding discomfort than it is at thinking about avoiding discomfort. Someone can't outthink their way around this speed difference. They have to change the conditions that make the amygdala activate in the first place. This is where dopamine enters the story, and where most people misunderstand what discipline actually is. Dopamine isn't the feel-good chemical. That's serotonin and endorphins. Dopamine is the motivation chemical, the anticipation molecule that makes the brain want to move towards something or do something. It's released when the brain predicts a reward is coming, not when the reward arrives. This is the crucial distinction that most motivational advice misses entirely. Think about what happens when someone checks their email. They open the app. There's a notification. There's an email from a client or a friend. Their brain instantly releases dopamine in anticipation of reading that email and finding out what's inside. The dopamine comes before the reward, before they've actually experienced anything positive. But it comes, and it feels good. And the brain learns. This behavior produces dopamine. Email checking produces dopamine. Therefore, email checking is worth doing. Now contrast this with writing. Someone sits down to write. They stare at a blank page. Their brain knows that if they write for an hour, they might produce a few paragraphs. But the payoff is abstract and distant. There's no notification. There's no immediate feedback. There's no dopamine hit waiting at the end of the next 5 minutes. The brain has to wait days or weeks to see the reward. A finished chapter, a completed manuscript, a book in the world. Most brains, faced with this choice, choose the email. This isn't weakness. This is how the dopamine system is designed to work. The brain's job is to move toward things that produce dopamine. Email produces immediate dopamine. Writing produces distant dopamine. The brain chooses email. It's that simple. Research on reward prediction. The way the brain learns what's worth doing shows that the brain assigns motivation value to actions based on how quickly and reliably they deliver reward. When someone checks email and gets a dopamine hit within seconds, the brain learns this behavior is worth repeating. The dopamine pathway strengthens. The next time the amygdala says, "This is hard," the brain has a well-established escape route. Check email. When someone writes for an hour and doesn't see any immediate payoff, the brain learns. This behavior isn't worth the effort. The dopamine prediction for writing gets weaker. The neural pathways that lead away from writing get stronger. Over time, these predictions become automatic. Someone doesn't have to consciously think, "I'll check email instead of writing." The brain has learned the pattern so well that the choice happens automatically, beneath conscious awareness. The amygdala activates discomfort. The dopamine system automatically routes toward the activity that's most reliably rewarding. The person finds themselves checking email before they've even consciously registered that they've stopped writing. Every time someone sits down to write and feels the resistance, and then stands up and checks their email instead, their brain is learning a lesson. The amygdala learns that moving away from discomfort is the winning strategy. The dopamine system learns that avoidance is immediately rewarding. The prefrontal cortex, the part that was supposed to maintain discipline, learns that it's powerless against these forces. Over months and years, these neural pathways don't just strengthen. They become the brain's default response. This is where a critical discovery from neuroscience changes everything. Chronic stress and repeated avoidance actually reduce the volume of gray matter in the prefrontal cortex. Brain imaging studies show that people who consistently avoid difficult tasks have physically smaller prefrontal cortexes than people who regularly face challenges. The brain literally shrinks in the region responsible for discipline. This isn't metaphorical. This is structural. This is why discipline becomes harder the more someone avoids it. They're not just developing bad habits. They're actually reducing the neurological hardware that supports discipline. At the same time, the amygdala and the dopamine reward pathways actually grow stronger. The brain allocates resources to the systems that are being used most. If someone spends months consistently avoiding discomfort, their brain invests in the avoidance systems. The amygdala gets more sensitive. The dopamine reward for escape gets stronger. The prefrontal cortex gets weaker. The brain is literally rewiring itself in a direction that makes discipline progressively harder. This explains something that almost everyone experiences. Discipline doesn't just fail once and then stay the same. Discipline fails progressively. Each failure makes the next attempt harder. Each time someone gives in to avoidance, they're not just experiencing a momentary setback. They're actually changing the structure of their brain in a way that makes future discipline even more difficult. This isn't a character flaw being expressed repeatedly. This is neurobiological restructuring happening in real time. The prefrontal cortex is where discipline lives, but it's also where conscious decision-making lives, where planning happens, where someone evaluates whether to say something harsh or hold their tongue, whether to stay focused or get distracted. The prefrontal cortex is doing a lot of work. And research on decision fatigue shows that it can only handle so much before it becomes depleted. Studies on ego depletion and willpower show that the prefrontal cortex's ability to resist impulses is a limited resource that gets exhausted throughout the day. Someone wakes up with a full tank of executive function. They make good decisions in the morning. They're focused and clear. But as the day goes on, they make decisions about what to wear, what to eat, what to say in a meeting, whether to check their phone, whether to respond to that email. Hundreds of small decisions, all drawing from the same limited prefrontal cortex resource. By afternoon, the tank is depleted. By evening, the prefrontal cortex is exhausted. This is why discipline is so much harder at the end of the day. Why evening snacking happens despite morning intentions. Why the difficult conversation with the business partner gets postponed until tomorrow. Add to this the fact that stress, poor sleep, inadequate nutrition, and chronic worry all drain the prefrontal cortex even faster. A person who's stressed is operating with a smaller reserve of executive function. A person who's sleep-deprived is operating with a prefrontal cortex that's barely functional. A person who's both stressed and sleep-deprived is operating with almost nothing in the tank. For these people, discipline isn't a choice. It's neurologically unavailable. The prefrontal cortex knows, on an intellectual level, that writing the book or starting the business or having the conversation is important. But it's also tired, depleted, and competing against an amygdala that's fully energized and a dopamine system that's been training for months to prefer escape. This isn't a fair fight. The prefrontal cortex is trying to win a battle with tools that are already broken. This brings us back to the fundamental problem. The amygdala is fast, and the prefrontal cortex is slow. When someone sits down to do something challenging, the amygdala detects discomfort and activates avoidance in about 12 milliseconds. The prefrontal cortex, meanwhile, is still trying to load the conscious decision about whether this task is really important. By the time conscious thought has even registered what's happening, the nervous system has already pivoted toward escape. By the time the person has made a conscious decision to sit down and write, their nervous system has already decided to check email instead. By the time they consciously register that they feel anxious about the difficult conversation, their body is already moving toward avoidance. By the time they're thinking, "I should exercise," they're already mentally cataloging reasons why today isn't a good day to exercise. This is why motivation and willpower fail. They're trying to use the conscious, slow system to override the unconscious, fast system. And the fast system always wins, at least until the brain's neurochemistry changes enough that the slow system can actually compete. No amount of positive thinking can override the amygdala's speed advantage. No amount of motivation can move faster than 12 milliseconds. The only solution is to change the conditions that make the amygdala activate in the first place. But the brain can change. Here's where hope enters. The brain isn't fixed. It's plastic, constantly rewiring itself based on experience and input. Every time someone does something difficult, every time they override the amygdala's resistance and do the thing anyway, their brain gets a signal that this behavior is survivable, that the discomfort doesn't actually kill them, that the reward on the other side is real. The brain learns. It updates its threat assessment. It builds new neural pathways that support discipline instead of avoidance. But this rewiring requires consistency and the right conditions. Most people try to force discipline through pure willpower, which is like trying to run a marathon on a body that's never trained. The brain needs preparation. It needs the right neurochemical state. It needs to be taught, through repeated experience, that the hard thing is actually survivable and worth doing. And most importantly, it needs something that almost no one thinks to provide: the biological foundation that makes sustained effort possible in the first place. Understanding this mechanism is essential because it shifts the entire conversation about discipline from personal failure to neurological fact. When someone realizes that their struggle with discipline isn't a character defect, but a predictable response of a brain that hasn't been given the right conditions to succeed, everything changes. The shame dissolves. The self-judgment quiets. What emerges instead is clarity. The brain can change. The neural pathways can be rewired. The dopamine system can learn new predictions. But it won't happen through willpower alone. It will happen when the brain is given what it actually needs. And that's where the one secret comes in. Chapter 2. The brain protein that changes everything. Most people have heard the term neuroplasticity by now. The idea that the brain can rewire itself, that neural pathways strengthen with use and weaken without it. It's become almost fashionable to talk about how the brain adapts and changes. Self-help books promise that if someone just thinks differently or practices mindfulness or visualizes their goals, their brain will reshape itself into something more capable, more resilient, more disciplined. The message is appealing. Your brain is plastic, so you can change it through the power of thought. But neuroplasticity isn't something that happens automatically, and it certainly isn't something that happens quickly through motivation or positive thinking alone. Neuroplasticity requires one specific ingredient that most people completely overlook. And that ingredient is a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. But for simplicity, think of it as growth protein. This growth protein is literally what builds new neural connections, strengthens existing ones, and repairs the damage that stress and avoidance have done to the brain's discipline circuits. Without sufficient growth protein, the brain stays stuck in its learned patterns. The avoidance pathways remain strong. The amygdala stays dominant. The prefrontal cortex stays weak. No amount of thinking, visualizing, or meditating can change this, because the brain doesn't have the biological building blocks required to construct new pathways. It's like trying to build a house with a blueprint, but no materials. The plan is there, but the physical construction can't happen. Most neuroplasticity fails for this exact reason. Someone reads about neuroplasticity and tries to rewire their brain through pure mental effort, through affirmations or visualization or cognitive restructuring. Nothing changes, because their brain doesn't have the growth protein required to actually build new neural connections. The prefrontal cortex doesn't get stronger. The dopamine system doesn't update its reward predictions. The amygdala doesn't learn that the hard thing is survivable. The person's brain, lacking the biological foundation, simply stays as it was. They feel like they've failed at neuroplasticity, when in reality they've just been trying to build a house without materials. Here's the breakthrough that neuroscience confirmed in 2025. Moderate aerobic exercise, the kind that gets the heart rate elevated but doesn't require someone to become a gym fanatic, dramatically increases the production of this growth protein. Not by a little bit, not by 5 or 10%, Studies show that 30 minutes of walking, cycling, or any sustained cardiovascular activity 3 times per week increases growth protein production by 62% in regions of the brain directly responsible for self-control and discipline. This isn't theoretical. This is measurable, observable, repeatable neuroscience. The prefrontal cortex, the exact region that's been losing its battle with the amygdala, gets stronger. The connections between regions that handle impulse control strengthen. The brain's ability to override the survival instinct improves dramatically. But here's what makes this truly revolutionary. The growth protein doesn't just strengthen existing circuits. It opens the door for new learning. When growth protein levels are elevated, the brain enters a state of heightened neuroplasticity. The neural connections become more malleable. The brain becomes more receptive to forming new habits, changing reward predictions, and building new neural pathways. It's like the brain's learning mode gets activated. Without this growth protein, the brain is locked in its learned patterns, resistant to change, stuck in the neural architecture it's built through years of repetition. With growth protein, the brain becomes capable of genuine transformation. This is why the growth protein surge is so critical for discipline. It's not just about making the prefrontal cortex slightly stronger. It's about opening a window where the brain can actually learn that the hard thing isn't as dangerous as the amygdala has been saying. During normal daily life, without elevated growth protein, the amygdala's threat assessment stays locked in. The brain doesn't update its learning. The dopamine predictions don't change. The neural pathways for avoidance stay strong because the brain has no tools to rebuild them. But when growth protein levels are elevated through consistent aerobic activity, the brain becomes receptive to new information, new learning, new neural configurations. The mechanism works like this. Growth protein stimulates the formation of new synapses, the connections between neurons. Every time a new synapse forms, it represents the brain building new circuitry, new pathways, new possibilities for signal transmission. The prefrontal cortex doesn't just get slightly better at resisting the amygdala's impulses. It literally gets rewired to handle challenge differently. New connections form between regions that support sustained effort and regions that process reward, creating new pathways where discipline becomes possible. The dopamine system, receiving signals from a stronger prefrontal cortex, updates its reward predictions. Writing begins to feel less like punishment and more like a survivable activity. This is what happened to Richard, the CEO who couldn't start his book. Richard had all the ingredients for success except one. His brain didn't have the biological foundation to support the discipline required for writing. His prefrontal cortex was exhausted from years of high-stress decision-making. His amygdala had been trained by repeated avoidance to believe that writing was dangerous. His dopamine system had learned that checking email and handling urgent business was immediately rewarding, while writing was distantly rewarding. His brain was stuck in a configuration that made discipline neurologically impossible. On day 1, Richard walked 30 minutes around his neighborhood. Nothing changed that day. No sudden rush of discipline, no miraculous transformation. His body simply began the process of signaling to his brain. Movement is happening. Effort is survivable. Challenge can be handled. His muscles burned slightly. His breathing deepened. His heart rate elevated. Somewhere in his brain, neurons were responding to this new input. The body is capable of sustained effort. The growth protein cascade began. By day 3, something subtle shifted. Richard's growth protein levels had begun to rise. His prefrontal cortex was receiving the first signals that new neural architecture was being laid down. When he sat down to write, the resistance was still there. His amygdala still said danger, but something in his nervous system felt slightly different. Less activated, less desperate. His body had learned, through 3 days of movement, that sustained effort didn't kill it. His brain was beginning to update its threat assessment. By day 7, after 1 full week of 3 walks, Richard noticed something that seemed unrelated to writing but was absolutely critical. His sleep improved. He fell asleep more easily. He woke fewer times during the night. His body felt less tense when he woke in the morning. His mood felt slightly more stable throughout the day. Nothing dramatic, but noticeable. What was happening was that his elevated growth protein levels were doing more than just rebuilding his discipline circuits. They were helping repair the damage that years of chronic stress had done to his nervous system. His brain was recovering. His body was healing. The neurological foundation that supports discipline was being rebuilt from the ground up. By week 2, something more significant happened. Richard walked on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday as planned. On Tuesday morning, he sat down to write. The discomfort was still present, the amygdala still activated. But it felt different. Less like a command and more like background noise. His prefrontal cortex, now strengthened by 2 weeks of growth protein production, could acknowledge the discomfort and choose to write anyway. Not through willpower, through restored neurochemical capacity. His brain had been given what it needed, and now discipline was neurologically possible. He wrote for 20 minutes that first day. The words came slowly, but they came. More importantly, his brain got the signal. I did the hard thing, and I survived it. That signal was crucial, because now his dopamine system had new data. Writing didn't kill him. Writing was survivable. The discomfort wasn't a threat. It was just discomfort. His brain's threat assessment began to update. The next day, writing felt slightly less threatening. The resistance was still there, but it was weaker. By week 2's end, Richard had written 50 pages. 50 pages in 1 week, after 10 years of paralysis. The transformation wasn't magic. It was biology. 2 weeks of consistent walking had done what months of motivation and willpower never could. It had changed the actual conditions inside his brain that make discipline possible. The mechanism deserves deeper exploration because it shows exactly why this works when so many other approaches fail. When growth protein levels are elevated, several things happen simultaneously in the brain. First, the prefrontal cortex literally gets stronger. The gray matter density increases. The neural connections thicken. The region responsible for sustained effort and delayed gratification becomes more robust. This isn't a minor change. Brain imaging shows measurable structural improvements in just 3 to 4 weeks of consistent aerobic activity. Second, the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala strengthen, but in a specific way. The prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate the amygdala's threat responses improves. The prefrontal cortex can't shut down the amygdala. It shouldn't, because the amygdala still has the important job of detecting real threats. But it can moderate the amygdala's response. It can tell the amygdala, I see that you're activated, but this isn't actually a threat. We can handle this. This is survivable. With growth protein supporting these connections, the prefrontal cortex's voice becomes loud enough to be heard over the amygdala's alarms. Third, the dopamine system's reward prediction gets updated. The brain isn't just learning that the hard thing is survivable. It's learning that the hard thing produces real, valuable dopamine, perhaps over a longer time frame but more deeply satisfying than the quick dopamine hit of email or distraction. The neural pathways that connect effort to reward get strengthened. The brain begins to predict that sustained, disciplined effort will eventually produce something worthwhile. This is the shift from avoidance to approach, from running away to moving toward. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the brain's stress response system itself gets recalibrated. The chronic elevation of stress hormones like cortisol gets reduced. The nervous system spends less time in high alert mode. The prefrontal cortex, which is damaged by chronic cortisol exposure, begins to heal. The entire brain becomes less reactive, less stuck in threat detection mode, more capable of nuance and complexity. The amygdala's sensitivity decreases. The prefrontal cortex's strength increases. The balance shifts. This raises an important question. Why can't someone just take a supplement of growth protein? Why does it have to come from exercise? The answer reveals something profound about how the brain works. Growth protein isn't just a chemical that makes the brain bigger. It's a signal. When the body engages in sustained aerobic activity, it's sending a message to the brain. The organism is capable. The body can handle sustained effort. Challenge is survivable. The growth protein is the brain's response to that message. It's saying, okay, if the body can handle that, I'm going to prepare the brain for more capability. If someone simply injected growth protein without the body having done anything to earn it, the brain wouldn't get the message. The brain wouldn't learn that challenge is survivable because the body hasn't actually demonstrated survivability. The growth protein would float around in the system, but the brain wouldn't use it to build new discipline circuitry because the brain hasn't received the necessary signal that new circuitry is needed. The growth protein is only useful when it's paired with the body's demonstration of capability through movement. This is why all the research on growth protein's effects on the brain points to exercise as the driver. The growth protein is produced in response to exercise. The elevated growth protein creates the neurochemical state where the brain can be rewired. The brain's learning systems activate because the body has demonstrated that learning is necessary. It's an integrated system, not just a chemical being added to the system. The body and brain are in conversation, and that conversation is what creates the conditions for discipline to emerge. During the elevated growth protein state that follows aerobic activity, the brain is literally more receptive to change. This window typically lasts for several hours after the exercise ends. During this window, if someone practices discipline, if they do the hard thing, the brain learns more effectively. The neural pathways supporting that disciplined action get reinforced. The dopamine predictions get updated more strongly. The prefrontal cortex learns more effectively that the hard thing is survivable. This is why consistency matters. If someone walks once and never again, the growth protein surge lasts a few hours. The brain briefly enters a state of heightened learning. But then the window closes and the old patterns reassert themselves. But if someone walks 3 times per week consistently, they're creating multiple windows per week where their brain is capable of learning new patterns. Over weeks, these repeated learning windows compound. The brain doesn't just temporarily become more capable. It rewires itself toward capability. The new neural pathways don't just form. They become the brain's new default. Richard understood this, whether consciously or not. He didn't just walk once. He walked consistently, 3 times per week, every week. By week 4, his brain had been through multiple learning windows, multiple opportunities to practice discipline and have that practice reinforced by the elevated growth protein state. His prefrontal cortex wasn't just slightly stronger, it was reconfigured. His dopamine system wasn't just updating its predictions, it was rebuilding its entire reward architecture. His brain wasn't just capable of writing, it was becoming rewired to write. This is the secret that changes everything. The human brain has the capacity to rewire itself, to rebuild its discipline circuits, to restore the balance between the survival brain and the thinking brain. But this rewiring doesn't happen through thought alone. It happens through movement. It happens through consistent, moderate cardiovascular activity that produces growth protein, signals to the brain that the body is capable, and opens the neurochemical window where genuine learning becomes possible. The growth protein is the physical mechanism that makes this transformation possible. And it's available to anyone willing to walk 30 minutes, 3 times per week. Chapter 3. The walk that rewires your discipline. Why walking, not running, or the gym? You might be wondering what form this movement actually takes. Because the word aerobic can sound intimidating to someone who hasn't exercised consistently in years, or who associates fitness with gyms and expensive equipment and the pressure to become an athlete. The beautiful part of what neuroscience shows is that the growth protein response doesn't require any of that. It doesn't require running marathons or joining CrossFit or training for a competition. It requires something far simpler and far more accessible. Walking. 30 minutes of walking at a pace where conversation is possible but not easy. Somewhere around 3 to 3.5 miles per hour. Triggers the exact same growth protein cascade that more intense exercise does. Your heart rate elevated, your breathing deeper, your body moving through space in a sustained, rhythmic way. That's the signal your brain needs. That's what tells your prefrontal cortex. The body is capable. Challenge is survivable. We can handle what comes next. A 30-minute walk 3 times per week is enough. Not daily. Not intense. Just consistent. But why walking specifically, and not high-intensity interval training or weightlifting or running? The research is clear. For someone with a nervous system that's been conditioned to perceive threat in discomfort, which is almost everyone trying to rebuild discipline, high-intensity exercise can actually backfire. High-intensity exercise activates the stress response system intensely. The amygdala gets more activated, not less. The cortisol spikes higher. The nervous system interprets the intense discomfort as a threat and reinforces the avoidance patterns the person is trying to break. Someone tries intense exercise, feels like they're dying, and their brain learns. Intense physical challenge is genuinely dangerous. The amygdala gets stronger, not weaker. Walking, by contrast, activates the growth protein response without triggering the threat cascade. Walking is something humans have been doing for millions of years. The body knows how to walk. There's no learning curve, no possibility of failure, no sense of being pushed beyond capability. The heart rate elevates, the breathing deepens, the body moves sustainably. But there's no moment where someone feels like they're in genuine danger. The nervous system relaxes into the movement rather than tightening against it. The research comparing different types of exercise for prefrontal cortex development shows that moderate intensity aerobic activity, the kind where someone could carry on a conversation but wouldn't want to, produces the most consistent growth protein response without triggering the stress response system's threat cascade. This is the sweet spot. Enough physical demand to signal capability, not so much physical demand that it signals threat. Walking hits this sweet spot perfectly. Walking also has another advantage that most people miss. It's meditative without requiring meditation. Many people try to calm their nervous system through meditation or breath work, and these practices are valuable. But they also require a certain mental discipline that someone with a weakened prefrontal cortex doesn't have yet. Sitting still and trying to control the mind is actually a difficult task when the prefrontal cortex is depleted and the amygdala is hyperactive. The mind wanders. The body feels restless. The person tries meditation, it doesn't work, and they feel like they've failed again. Walking, by contrast, is something the body can do while the mind settles naturally. As someone walks, their breathing naturally deepens. The rhythm of footsteps creates a natural cadence that the nervous system can synchronize with. The forward motion creates a sense of progress and momentum. The eyes track the environment, giving the brain something to process that's neither threatening nor demanding intense focus. The nervous system, almost without conscious effort, shifts from the stress response back toward baseline calm. What's happening neurologically during a walk is profound, even though it doesn't feel intense or challenging. The sympathetic nervous system, the part that activates the stress response, begins to downregulate. The parasympathetic nervous system, the part that supports rest and recovery, begins to activate. This shift is exactly what the prefrontal cortex needs to heal. Cortisol levels, which have been chronically elevated from years of stress and amygdala activation, begin to decline. The prefrontal cortex, which has been damaged by chronic cortisol exposure, begins to recover. The growth protein that's being produced is being delivered to a nervous system that's in a state conducive to healing, not defensive against threat. This is why people often report that they think more clearly after a walk, or that solutions to problems emerge unexpectedly while walking. It's not mystical. It's neurobiology. The prefrontal cortex, no longer flooded with cortisol and amygdala activation, has the capacity for creative thinking, for planning, for nuanced decision-making. The brain, relaxed into the movement, can process information in ways it can't when it's in defensive mode. Here's what's important to understand. You don't need to become someone who loves exercise. You don't need to develop a fitness identity or commit to a lifetime of athletic pursuits. You just need to give your brain the biological signal that builds the neurochemical foundation for discipline. 30 minutes, 3 times per week, is enough. A walk around your neighborhood is enough. A walk on a treadmill is enough. A walk in a park, on a trail, through the city, through suburbs. Any form of sustained, moderate cardiovascular movement is enough. The walk doesn't need to be special. It doesn't need to be scenic or interesting or enjoyable. In fact, some people find that walking while listening to something, a podcast, an audiobook, music, helps the time pass more easily and gives the mind something to rest on without demanding intense focus. Other people prefer silence. Other people enjoy the social aspect and walk with a friend, which adds another neurological benefit. Social connection activates different reward pathways and strengthens the parasympathetic nervous system even more. The key requirement is consistency, not intensity or enjoyment. The brain needs repeated signals that the body is capable of sustained effort. 3 walks per week consistently for at least 3 weeks is the minimum required for the growth protein effects to build into lasting changes in brain structure. Most people notice subtle shifts: better sleep, slightly more stable mood, a reduction in baseline anxiety after 1 week. The bigger shifts, the actual rewiring of discipline circuits, take 3 to 4 weeks. But they do happen, reliably, in anyone willing to walk consistently. The person who commits to walking 3 times per week in week 1 is sending a signal to their brain. The body is capable. On the first walk, nothing feels dramatic. The person might feel slightly tired afterward or slightly energized. Their growth protein levels are elevated, but not enough yet to create obvious changes. But the brain has registered the signal. Something has shifted at a neurological level, even if it's not consciously perceptible yet. By day 3 or day 4, subtle changes often emerge. Sleep might improve slightly. The person falls asleep more easily. The quality feels better. The baseline anxiety that's been present for months or years might diminish slightly. Nothing dramatic, but noticeable. This isn't imagination. The elevated growth protein is signaling to the nervous system. Challenge is survivable. The threat response can downregulate slightly. The body doesn't need to stay in high alert all the time. This shift in baseline nervous system tone is one of the first changes to emerge from consistent walking. By the end of week 1, most people notice something else. Their mood is slightly more stable. The day-to-day emotional fluctuations that often accompany stress and amygdala hyperactivity begin to smooth out. The person feels more even, more grounded. They might not understand why. They might attribute it to something else. But neurologically, what's happening is that the elevated growth protein is repairing damage that chronic stress has done to the emotional regulation systems in the brain. By week 2, the real shift begins. The growth protein has been elevated consistently for 2 weeks. The prefrontal cortex has been receiving constant signals that new neural architecture is being laid down. The prefrontal cortex is getting stronger. It's not dramatically stronger. The person won't feel like a different human, but measurably stronger. This is when the person's capacity for discipline begins to return, not because they suddenly develop willpower, but because their prefrontal cortex, the neurological foundation of discipline, is being rebuilt. When they sit down to do the hard thing, write, make the call, start the project, the resistance is still there. The amygdala still activates. The discomfort is still present. But something has changed. The prefrontal cortex now has enough strength to acknowledge the discomfort and choose to act anyway. Not through force, through restored neurochemical capacity. Richard, at this point in his journey, sat down to write on day 8 of his walking routine. He wrote for 20 minutes. The words came slowly, but they came. More importantly, his brain got a crucial signal. I did the hard thing, and I survived it. His dopamine system had new data. Writing wasn't safe exactly. His amygdala still activated. But writing wasn't deadly. The threat assessment began to update. The next day, writing felt slightly less threatening. The resistance was still there, but it was weaker, less compelling. By week 3, the compounding effect becomes clear. Richard has now had multiple walks, multiple windows of elevated growth protein, multiple opportunities to practice discipline while his brain was in a state conducive to learning. His prefrontal cortex isn't just slightly stronger, it's reconfigured. His dopamine system isn't just updating its predictions, it's rebuilding its entire reward architecture around sustained effort instead of escape. The research on growth protein and exercise frequency shows a clear pattern. 3 walks per week is the minimum required for the neurological changes to build. 1 walk per week isn't enough. The growth protein elevation lasts a few hours. The window of neuroplasticity opens and closes, but the brain doesn't get enough repeated learning opportunities to rewire itself. 2 walks per week is better, but still marginal. 3 walks per week creates 3 separate windows of elevated neuroplasticity per week, enough for the brain to begin forming lasting new patterns. 4 walks per week is fine, but not necessarily better. Beyond 3 per week, the returns diminish. The growth protein response plateaus. The brain gets enough signal that it doesn't need more. More importantly, for someone rebuilding discipline, more isn't always better. The goal isn't to become an athlete. The goal is to give the brain the minimum necessary input to rebuild its discipline circuits. 3 walks per week is efficient. 3 walks per week is sustainable. 3 walks per week is enough. The time of day matters less than the consistency. Ideally, someone would walk at the same time each day, because the brain's circadian rhythm, its internal clock, reinforces habits that happen at consistent times. Morning walks, before the prefrontal cortex is depleted by the day's decisions, might have a slight advantage. But this advantage is small compared to the importance of simply walking consistently, regardless of time. Many people find that combining walking with something else, listening to music, listening to a podcast or audiobook, walking with a friend, makes the habit easier to maintain. The walking becomes less of a fitness task and more of a natural part of the day. Someone doesn't need to motivate themselves to listen to their favorite podcast. They just do it. The walk becomes incidental to the podcast, not the other way around. Other people find that planning the walk, putting it on the calendar, treating it as a non-negotiable appointment, makes consistency easier. The walk becomes as automatic as going to work. No decision required, just movement at the scheduled time. The specific location, the specific pace, the specific distance. These matter far less than most people think. The goal is growth protein elevation and neurochemical signaling. A slow walk around a boring neighborhood triggers the same growth protein response as a brisk walk on a scenic trail. The brain doesn't care if the walk is beautiful. It cares that the body is moving sustainably, that the nervous system is receiving a signal of capability, that growth protein is being produced. By the end of week 3, something remarkable often happens. The person sits down to do the hard thing and finds that the resistance is weaker. Not gone, the amygdala still activates, the discomfort is still present, but weaker, more manageable, more like background noise than a command. They do the hard thing, they write, they make the call, they start the project. And then something crucial happens. They succeed. They don't write a perfect chapter, but they write something. They make the call, and it's awkward but survivable. They start the project, and the first step is complete. Their brain gets a signal. I did it. I survived. The hard thing was painful but survivable. The dopamine system updates its predictions. Writing begins to feel less like punishment and more like a survivable activity. The neural pathways supporting discipline get reinforced. And now the snowball effect begins. The person's walking has created the conditions for discipline to emerge. Their discipline is creating success. Their success is creating motivation. Their motivation makes future discipline easier. The cycle that had been spinning downward, avoidance creates weakness, weakness makes avoidance more likely, begins to spin upward. Movement creates capacity. Capacity creates discipline. Discipline creates success. Success creates motivation. Motivation makes future movement easier and more rewarding. This is why the walk is so important, even though it seems simple. The walk isn't just exercise. The walk is the seed. It's the first input into a system that's been spinning downward. Once the seed is planted, once the growth protein begins its work, the rest of the transformation can follow. Chapter 4. Real Transformations. Sarah was 42 years old when she realized she'd spent the last 15 years saying she would do something meaningful with her design skills, but never actually doing it. She had ideas, dozens of them, sketches that never left her notebook, projects that remained conversations at dinner parties. She told herself she'd start her own design business when the kids were older, when work was less demanding, when she had more time, when she felt more ready. The excuses were reasonable. They were also endless. What Sarah didn't understand was that her brain was working against her. The design work required sustained focus and creative effort. The immediate reward was distant. Maybe months away when a project might be complete, published, seen by someone. Her amygdala, trained by years of avoidance, had learned that the discomfort of starting far outweighed the value of the distant reward. Her dopamine system had learned that email and meetings and task management software delivered immediate satisfaction. Her prefrontal cortex, the part that could sustain discipline toward a long-term goal, had been depleted by 15 years of demanding work and parenting. Sarah's transformation began not with a decision to finally start her design business. It began with a walk. One of her colleagues mentioned that she walked during lunch, and something about Sarah's conversation, the wistfulness about her unfinished projects, the frustration with her own paralysis, made the colleague suggest that Sarah try walking too. Just 30 minutes. Just 3 times a week. Sarah was skeptical, but she was also desperate. She was approaching an age where she felt like her chance was slipping away. She tried it. She walked around the same neighborhood where she'd lived for 12 years, the place she'd walked hundreds of times before, but now with purpose. Her growth protein levels began to rise. By day 7, her sleep improved. By day 14, her baseline anxiety had diminished. Her prefrontal cortex was receiving the signal that the body was capable. By week 3, something shifted. Sarah sat down to design something, just a small personal project, nothing for anyone else. And the resistance was weaker. The discomfort was still there, but it felt manageable. She designed for 30 minutes, then an hour. Her dopamine system, which had been trained to avoid design work, began receiving new information. Sustained design effort is survivable. By week 4, she'd completed a small project. By month 2, she'd completed 3. The walking hadn't made her creative. She'd always been creative. The walking had given her prefrontal cortex the neurological foundation it needed to maintain discipline toward her creative work. The growth protein had repaired the damage that years of stress and avoidance had done. Her brain, finally receiving the right input, had rewired itself toward capability. Today, Sarah's design business, which started as a side project while she walked, generates more income than her day job. The transformation took time. It required consistent walking, but it required nothing else. No expensive courses or coaching or retreats. Just the biological foundation that allowed her brain to operate at its capacity. Marcus was 38 years old, a manager at a tech company, and stuck in what he'd come to think of as permanent procrastination. Everything at work that required sustained focus, writing reports, analyzing data, planning strategy, got pushed to tomorrow. The urgent things, responding to emails, attending meetings, handling immediate problems, consumed his days. By the time he had capacity for the important work, he was exhausted and the prefrontal cortex was depleted. He'd tried everything: productivity systems, time blocking, accountability partners, motivation coaches. Nothing worked because none of these approaches addressed the fundamental problem. His brain didn't have the neurochemical foundation to support sustained effort on non-urgent work. Marcus's solution came from a practical constraint. His company relocated their office, and suddenly his commute changed. Instead of a 15-minute drive, he had a 20-minute walk. At first, he resented this. He wanted to drive. But the parking situation made driving difficult, and slowly he adapted to walking. By week 1 of his new walking commute, nothing felt different. He walked to work in the morning, walked home in the evening. By week 2, his sleep had improved. He fell asleep more quickly and woke feeling more rested. By week 3, something shifted at work. When he sat down to write a report, the resistance was weaker. The discomfort of sustained focus was still present, but his prefrontal cortex, now strengthened by 2 weeks of growth protein elevation, had more power to override the avoidance impulse. For the first time in years, Marcus completed a report in focused blocks rather than fragmented crisis management. By month 2, he'd submitted 3 major reports and completed a strategic analysis that his boss had been waiting months to receive. The elevated focus and capacity didn't just affect his output, it affected his role. He was promoted within 4 months. The growth protein from his walks had rebuilt his discipline circuits, and his discipline had transformed his career. Marcus didn't need to add anything to his life. His commute was already happening. He simply walked instead of driving, triggering the growth protein response that rebuilt his capacity for sustained focus. Jennifer was 55 years old when she realized she'd lost her patience with her grandchildren. She loved them fiercely, but by the end of visits, she'd snapped at them over minor infractions, apologized, felt guilty, and blamed herself for being impatient. She understood, intellectually, that she should respond with more calm, but in the moment, her amygdala would hijack her. Small frustrations would trigger disproportionate anger. What Jennifer didn't understand was that her amygdala hyperactivity was connected to her chronic stress and her lack of movement. She'd been sedentary for years. Her nervous system was stuck in a state of high alert. Her prefrontal cortex, the part that could moderate emotional responses and choose patience, was constantly depleted. Her dopamine system had learned that emotional reactivity produced quick relief, that snapping at the kids gave her a moment of feeling powerful and in control, even though it left her feeling guilty afterward. Her transformation came from an unexpected source. She started walking with a friend. The walks were partly social. They talked about their lives, their families, their frustrations. But they were also exercise. 30 minutes, 3 times per week, consistently. By week 2, Jennifer's baseline anxiety had reduced. She wasn't reactive to everything. By week 3, when one of her grandchildren spilled juice on her rug, she felt the impulse to snap, but her prefrontal cortex, now strengthened by weeks of growth protein production, had enough power to pause. She didn't yell. She took a breath. She helped clean up. That moment, that one moment where she didn't react automatically but chose her response, created a new neural pathway. Her brain learned that she could handle frustration without immediately releasing it through anger. By month 2, her family started commenting that she seemed calmer. Her grandchildren, no longer bracing for her snapping, were more relaxed around her. Her relationship with them deepened. The walk had done more than rebuild her discipline circuits. It had allowed her to rebuild the emotional regulation that had been damaged by years of stress and reactivity. Her prefrontal cortex, finally given the support it needed, had regained its power to moderate her amygdala's impulses. The common thread in these transformations is that the walks weren't added as a special task. They were built into existing routines or created through practical constraints. This is crucial because adding another obligation to an already overwhelmed life is exactly the kind of thing that leads to failure. The walking needs to become as automatic as brushing teeth, something that happens without decision, without motivation required. The most sustainable way to accomplish this is to replace something that's already happening with a walk. If someone drives to work, they could walk or take public transportation and walk. If someone typically sits for lunch, they could walk instead. If someone drives to do errands, they could walk if the distance is reasonable. The walk doesn't add time to the day, it replaces time that was going to be spent anyway. For people with longer commutes, walking part of the way works. Someone might drive halfway and then walk the rest. Or take the train and walk to the station instead of driving. Or park further away and walk from the parking lot. The brain doesn't care if the walk is the entire commute. It cares that the walk is happening consistently. For people without a natural commute or errand-based opportunity, the walk becomes scheduled like an appointment. Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 6 p.m. Tuesday, Thursday at 7 a.m. The specific time matters less than the consistency. The brain learns. This is when movement happens. This is non-negotiable, like sleep or work. Some people combine the walk with something else they need to do. Listen to a podcast they want to hear, call a friend they've been meaning to talk to, listen to an audiobook. The walk becomes not a dedicated fitness task, but a time block where multiple needs are met simultaneously. Someone listens to a podcast they love, gets exercise, and produces growth protein. All three happen at once. Other people use the walk as a transition between work and home. In the morning, the walk wakes up the nervous system and sets a calm, focused tone for the day. In the evening, the walk transitions from work stress to home time, allowing the nervous system to downregulate from work mode to home mode. The key insight is that walking doesn't require special conditions. It doesn't require a gym, equipment, or athleticism. It doesn't require that the person be in good shape or that they enjoy exercise. It just requires that movement happens consistently, 3 times per week. The growth protein response happens regardless of whether someone enjoys it or finds it meaningful. The brain doesn't care if the walk is beautiful or boring. The brain cares that the signal is being sent. The body is capable of sustained effort. When the walk is embedded into existing routines rather than added as a special task, something important happens. The person doesn't need motivation to walk. They walk because it's what happens at that time, like going to work or eating lunch. This removes the biggest barrier to consistency: motivation. Someone might not feel motivated to exercise, but they will walk if walking is simply what happens at that time, as automatic as the commute itself. This consistency, maintained over weeks, creates the compound effect. Each walk triggers growth protein production. Each period of elevated growth protein opens a window where the brain is receptive to learning. Each opportunity to practice discipline during this window reinforces the new neural pathways. After 3 weeks of consistent walking, the prefrontal cortex is demonstrably stronger. After 2 months, the brain has been substantially rewired. The hard thing that was neurologically impossible is now neurologically possible. And here's what's crucial. Once the walks have rebuilt the prefrontal cortex and the dopamine system has been retrained, the person's relationship to discipline has fundamentally shifted. They're not fighting their brain anymore. Their brain is now on their side. The prefrontal cortex is strong. The dopamine system has learned that sustained effort is worthwhile. The amygdala has learned that the hard thing is survivable. Discipline, which had been neurologically impossible, becomes neurologically natural. The person doesn't need to keep forcing themselves. The discipline has become automatic because the neurological foundation supports it. They might keep walking because they've learned that it helps them think, or because they enjoy the time to themselves, or because it's simply what they do. But the walking isn't the struggle anymore. The walking is the normal, automatic part of life. This is why these transformations stick. Richard didn't just have a moment of motivation that faded. His brain was rewired, his discipline circuits were rebuilt, his dopamine system was retrained. The changes are structural, not motivational. They persist because the brain has been physically changed, not just inspired to change. Everything in this audiobook points to one truth. Discipline is not a character trait. Discipline is a neurochemical state that emerges when your prefrontal cortex is strong. Your dopamine system has learned that the hard thing is worth doing, and your nervous system is regulated enough to handle challenge. For years, most people try to build discipline through willpower alone. They try to think their way to discipline, to motivate themselves harder, to read one more book about productivity. And it never works. because they're trying to use a weakened tool to override a system that's been trained through repetition to avoid. But when your brain is given what it actually needs, when growth protein is triggered through consistent walking, when your prefrontal cortex is rebuilt, when your dopamine system learns that effort is worth it, discipline stops being a struggle. Discipline becomes what your brain naturally does. The one secret is that movement changes everything. 30 minutes of walking, 3 times per week. That's all your brain needs to begin rewiring itself toward discipline. Your brain is capable of this transformation right now. You don't need to become a different person. You don't need more willpower or more motivation. Your capacity for discipline is there, waiting for the biological conditions that allow it to emerge. The only thing standing between you and sustainable discipline is 30 minutes of walking, 3 times per week. Schedule one 30-minute walk this week. Write it in your calendar. Not tomorrow, this week. Then schedule 2 more walks on different days. 3 walks this week. Consistency is what matters. By the end of week 1, you'll sleep better and feel slightly calmer. By week 2, the changes become noticeable. By week 3, when you sit down to do the hard thing, the resistance will be weaker than it's ever been. From there, the transformation compounds. Right now, pull up your calendar. Pick 3 days this week and schedule 30-minute walks. Not vague intentions, scheduled, non-negotiable appointments. Then do it. Walk. Let your brain register the signal. By the end of week 3, you'll feel the shift. By the end of month 2, discipline will feel natural. Your first step starts today, not tomorrow. Today. Schedule the walk. Your brain is ready. Your capacity is there. All it's waiting for is the signal. Now go.